like to welcome Bob Price from Breitbart, Texas, onto the show. Bob is one of the senior writers for Breitbart, Texas, and, of course, is been writing for years on the challenges that we've got along the border. Bob, Merry Christmas. Welcome to the show.
Merry Christmas, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I hope you had a pleasant one. One of the more interesting news stories out of Lubbock, Texas the last couple of days has been Senator Charles Perry's Sanctuary Cities bill that he has authored, and it will now go through the legislature in the upcoming session, which starts January 10th. How do you how do you feel has been the reaction to that bill? Do you hear people reacting to it positively? What's been your take on it?
So far, I think the reaction has been pretty good. The Texas Association of Business, of course, came out against it, as they always do.
Right.
But the governor is supporting it. The lieutenant governor, and I spoke with the Speaker of the House. They're supporting the bill. So it's a good situation. I think we'll actually see it get passed. They've tried in years past to do this, and it's always gotten blocked either in the Senate or the House. They've never been able to get through both bodies of the legislature at the same time, and so hopefully this is the year.
The other interesting aspect of this is that, that grew out of that case, and I'm not saying Perry's bill grew out of the case, but that case out in San Francisco where that fellow who'd been deported 3 or 4 times, came back and was living in San Francisco and murdered that young lady on the pier in San Francisco, which a lot of people have forgotten about, but people along the border deal with this kind of thing every day, don't they?
Yes, and the Kate Steinle case in San Francisco was certainly the most visible, but we've had many cases like that here in Texas. That same week as the Kate Steinle case, we had a case in El Paso where a illegal immigrant who'd been deported several times and had been back and forth across the border, murdered a woman with a hammer. Mm-hmm. Just horrific situations. We had a case in Austin just a couple months ago where a guy had been deported 5 times, and excuse me, and after the 4th time, the ICE immigration officials actually asked the DOJ to prosecute the guy for illegal reentry, and the DOJ refused to do it. He came back again and went on a series of rapes and assaults against at least 9 women in the Austin, Texas area. So it's you hear about it in other places, but it's a very active problem here in the state of Texas. It's
interesting because a lot of national immigration rights groups have called Perry out on it. A lot of bad names, calling him a fascist and evil and so on and so forth. Isn't it amazing how when a legislator in any state tries to do what's right for the people who he was elected by, people across the country feel the need to chime in and castigate that person, and they have absolutely no conception of what's going on here.
Well, when you can't defeat the argument, the only thing left is to attack the messenger, and that's certainly what they do in these situations. When you've got situations where you have law enforcement officers like the Sheriff Valdez in Dallas County, the incoming sheriff in Travis County in Austin, who blatantly say that they will, at least in the case of the Dallas sheriff, she said that she would look at ICE detainers on a case-by-case basis and decide whether she would honor them or not. And the sheriff-elect in Travis County has said that she will throw out the ICE agents that actually work in the jail and not cooperate at all with ICE agents. And so that puts them in direct violation of federal law. And our Congressman John Culberson in Houston actually found a way to take existing law and force the DOJ to certify, so far, at least 10 cities or 10 jurisdictions as sanctuary city jurisdictions and make them ineligible for future law enforcement grants from the Department of Justice. And, of course, the biggest one on that list is the entire state of California, who stands to lose $300 million this year and could actually be forced to pay back about $6.3 billion in back funds they've received if they don't change their policies. And that's by using existing law. We didn't have to go out and make any new laws or wait for the new president to come in. We got action moving right away.
You wrote rather a story over the weekend, and it was a great story. I'd encourage everybody who can go online to read Bob's piece on Border Patrol agents not really serving in their typical role. They actually were performing life-saving roles over the past week or so. Tell us about that.
Well, these happen frequently, and we try to get the word out. The Border Patrol is one of the most maligned law enforcement agencies in the United States, and Border Patrol agents are the most assaulted by their perpetrators, the most assaulted federal agents in law enforcement. And so when we're doing things out of the norm, which is not really out of the norm for them, but it appears out of the norm in terms of publicity they receive, we try to recognize that. We had a situation this morning that we wrote about where the human smugglers in New Mexico had this group of, I think it was 18 or 19 illegal aliens that they'd brought across the border. Most of these were minors and women, and they just abandoned them out in the middle of the desert. It was freezing rain, sleet, and high winds. You can imagine the horrific conditions. If you've ever, I know you've been in New Mexico. The wind is not your friend there, especially when it's wet and blowing like that. Their life expectancy drops very quickly. And fortunately, these Border Patrol agents found them and rescued them, saved their lives, and of course now they'll be processed, and some of them will be sent back. And unfortunately, one of the minors in this situation was a 1-year-old infant that these ruthless coyotes just abandoned out there in the fields. But the migrant children, unfortunately, will probably be processed and distributed to refugee stations along the United States. It's funny not funny at all. The Department of Health and Human Services is actually taking money away from medical research, cancer research for American citizens to pay for the cost of housing this flood of illegal immigrants that keeps crossing the border in record numbers this year.
Have you any sense, Bob, of any kind of a timeline that you may have heard? And I know he's not even been inaugurated yet, but have you gotten any sense of how they're going to approach building the wall in certain sections of the border?
Well, I think that it's going to be a process. Certainly not something that they can immediately do, although I think he will immediately request legislative action to get started on it. But one thing that people forget is Congress has already passed legislation for building a wall. And so they'll be able to go into that and find ways to fund that legislation. Kay Bailey Hutchison was one of the ones that was involved in actually passing that bill, but then she immediately came along and defunded it after she passed the authorization for it. So, back during the Bush administration. At this point, we just need to figure out how to fund that part of it and get it started. The president-elect, once he takes office, he will start working with Mexico on negotiating the trade agreements and finding ways of taking funding and applying it towards building that wall so that Mexico actually does pay for it.
We've got another minute in this segment, and we'll come back after that with Bob Price from Breitbart, Texas. But, I think the wall ties very neatly into what you reported on about the Border Patrol rescuing the migrants from freezing to death and from dying. If that door is locked, you're not even going to try to get through there, and you're not going to put your life at risk. And it seems to me that while the border wall will give us a certain amount of immigration security, it'll also just save a ton of lives. Don't you agree?
Oh, it will. In Brooks County alone, down in Falfurrias, Texas, there have been nearly 60 bodies that they've recovered out in the fields this year alone. Several hundred people have died in just this one county over the past 10 years. And you hear all this talk from the left about, we must be compassionate, but what they don't realize is that these ruthless cartels have turned human smuggling into a cash crop. It's actually, they make as much money off of that as they do off of transporting drugs now. And, but they don't care about these people at all. They shove them into the backs of cars and pickup trucks stacked in there like sardines in a can. And if there's an accident or something, they don't care what happens to them. They abandon them out in these fields and just leave them to die. And unfortunately, we see way too many times the results of this so-called compassion from the left that leaves these people dead in the fields.
We're listening to Bob Price with Breitbart, Texas, Bob being one of the senior writers. When we come back after the break, we're going to catch up with Bob on several other issues, not the least of which is the latest with the cartel activity along the border. You're listening to 790 KFYO, the Chad Hasty Show. We'll be right back. And we're back with the Chad Hasty Show. My name is Matt Crow, substituting for Chad, who's off on vacation. He'll be back right after the New Year's. We're on the phone with Bob Price, one of the senior writers for Breitbart, Texas. And Bob's been bringing us up to speed on the challenges of the Border Patrol. And Bob, over the weekend, too, I read on Breitbart, Texas, there's really incredible that one of the cartels down there was kidnapping people who'd been deported from Texas and then holding them for ransom. How was that all working?
Yeah, it just goes to the ruthlessness of these people down there. The horrific situation just south of our border, unfortunately. And Brandon Darby there, who's there in Lubbock, and Ildefonso Ortiz, our border reporter, have done a great job in working with Mexican citizen journalists down there, what we call our cartel chronicles, where we get real reports of what's happening. The media in the communities just south of the border can't report this news because they're in fear of their lives. So we have these people that work anonymously with us and get the truth out about what's happening down there. These people that get deported back from the United States into Mexico are very vulnerable, of course, once they get there. And so these guys snatch them up and hold them hostage and demand more money. It's the same thing when they're smuggling them northbound. They do the same thing. They tell them that it's going to cost them $6,000 to get to the United States, but they stop them at various stash houses along the way and beat them, rape the women, and hold them for more ransom from their families.
The incredible thing about this is that the challenge with the cartels has been gone on for so long, and again, like a lot of major challenges from a national security standpoint that the country faces. Do you see any movement towards not solving the problem, but dampening down the influence of the cartels under the Trump administration? Do you see any glimmer of hope from a Trump Justice Department or a Trump Border Security Department, Homeland Security Department, that might happen in any near future, a Trump DEA?
Well, Mr. Trump has been very active in seeking counsel from the men and women of the Border Patrol unions, the actual troops on the ground that see this stuff happening, working very closely with the ICE union as well. And so he's hearing firsthand from agents in the field what the real conditions are down there, not the Potemkin Village dog and pony show that VIPs get when they go travel to the border. I think the Trump administration will be very aggressive about trying to root out the corruption in the government down there and force Mexico to cooperate. We have extradition orders right now, for example, of two of the past governors of the state of Tamaulipas, who are wanted for cooperation and their participation in the drug cartels in that state that's right across the border from Matamoros, Matamoros and Reynosa, right across the border from McAllen, Brownsville, and all along that area.
If Hillary, go ahead.
Yeah, so we've just got to build the level of communication, and for them to know that we're serious about supporting them, but also serious about demanding that they live up to their extradition treaties so that we can get these corrupt officials up here and punish them in the American courts for violations there. We're seeing a lot more aggressiveness along the border from these cartels. Unfortunately, just about a month or so ago, a DPS trooper was shot in the leg, and a Border Patrol agent was shot in the chest. Fortunately, his vest protected him. But by bullets coming from across the river in a gunfight between the cartels and either another faction of the cartel, the civil war that's going on down there, or in battles with the military. We don't have all the facts on it yet. And, with two law enforcement officials being struck at the same time on this side of the border, you have to wonder if they were actually targets of the gunfire as opposed to just stray bullets.
And it's not a question of funding, is it, Bob? I mean, are the Border Patrol agents, do they feel like they have the resources they need, or are they saying otherwise?
No, they don't have the resources they need. Their equipment is old, it's worn out. They don't have the funding that they need. They don't have the manpower that they need. And that's one of the promises that President-elect Trump has made, is that they will increase the manpower of the Border Patrol agents down there and Customs and Border Protection officers as well. But the equipment and stuff, I've talked to Border Patrol agents that work on the river boats down in the Rio Grande Valley that actually have to hold their night vision goggles on because the straps have broken on it that hold them in place, and they can't see what's going on without it. And so he's driving the boat with one hand and literally holding his night vision goggles on with the other hand, and they don't have the money to get them repaired. Changing
gears for a second, the fact that Trump won the presidency and that Hillary Clinton lost, you must get a sense from not only Border Patrol agents, but from law enforcement in general. And I know you follow very closely law enforcement issues and court issues and crime and punishment, but don't you get a sense that there's maybe a sense of relief, but also a sense of expectation now that Hillary Clinton will not become president?
Well, I think there was a great sigh of relief by law enforcement all across the country, and certainly particularly by the Border Patrol agents. But, the Obama administration throughout its history, almost from day one, was anti-police. When you look back at the incident that happened in Cambridge where the black professor was arrested outside his home because the officer thought he might be trying to break into the house, the president's immediate assumption was that the police acted stupidly. And that, and it turned out he was wrong, as he has been in almost every situation like this. But in every case, the president has immediately put down the law enforcement officers and made a mockery of their position and demeaned them, only to find out later, like in the Trayvon Martin case and in the Ferguson, Missouri case, it was the law enforcement person. Well, Trayvon Martin wasn't a law enforcement person, but in the Ferguson case, the law enforcement officer was doing his job. He was being beaten to within an inch of his life. There was no hands up, don't shoot situation. He was trying to take the officer's gun away from him. And when the facts came out, it didn't matter to this president. He still invited the people to the White House, sent emissaries from the White House to the funeral of this guy. It's always been a situation where he puts down law enforcement, and so now you have a president that campaigned on law and order, who's going to come in and restore the dignity that these people deserve, the honor that these people deserve. 126 officers so far this year have given their lives in the line of duty, 90 some odd from gunfire alone. Just an amazing number of people that have been killed, and it's this disrespect of law enforcement from the top that fuels that.
We're listening to Bob Price from Breitbart, Texas. Bob's one of the senior writers from Breitbart, Texas, reports on a number of issues, but one of which, of course, crime and punishment and the border security and immigration. Do you think, we've got about a minute left in this segment, Bob, and if I could get you for another segment after this one, that'd be terrific, because I've got a few more questions for you. But do you think we'll see any legislation this coming year in the Texas legislature which is going to benefit police officers in Texas?
I think there's going to be a big push in the Texas legislature to back our law enforcement officers and let them know. There's already a movement to have a bill filed to make the murder of a police officer simply because he's a police officer, to classify that as a hate crime and instill additional punishment on that. There's a lot of things we can do for our law enforcement officers, and I think you'll see the legislature taking a very active role on that.
Well, that is good news. Bob, if you can, stay with us another segment if you could. I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Fantastic. All right, you're listening to the Chad Hasty Show. I'm Matt Crow on News Talk 790 AM KFYO. You can also listen to us on the FM side at 95.1 FM. We'll be back with Bob Price from Breitbart, Texas, right after this. Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show. You're listening to KFYO 790 on the AM dial and 95.1 on the FM dial. On the phone, we have Bob Price from Breitbart, Texas. Bob's one of the senior writers at Breitbart, Texas. Bob, I want to ask you about two things before we kind of look ahead for 2017 with Breitbart and give us kind of an idea of where Breitbart's going to be going next year as far as their reporting is concerned. But first, I wanted to ask you, here once again, we've got a situation in Fort Worth this time of a police officer arriving on the scene of a disturbance of some sort, not really knowing what's going on, only having the bare essentials on the radio from his headquarters, pulling up and being immediately confronted and yelled at and argued with and faced with uncooperative people. I'm not going to say that they were white or black people because it doesn't matter. We'll get to that in a second. But, you know, the video goes viral over the weekend. I saw it 16 or 17 times over Christmas as I was watching the news. What is your perspective? You work so closely with law enforcement. Is the morale so bad that they're going to start pulling punches because they've got their chest cameras on and their dash cameras on and cell phone cameras pointed at them? I'm not saying that, you know, that there's a certain amount of transparency which is needed in law enforcement, but God, you know, after a while, it just seems like these guys can't do anything right. And I know they want to go home alive, but where do you see this all heading with the police as far as how they deal with people?
Well, unfortunately, our police officers are asked to do a lot of different things, many times things that they shouldn't even be asked to do, that there should be other ways of handling in society. But when you see situations like this, you know, many officers have been called to domestic violence situations this year, only to find that it's a setup to be attacked and shot and killed. And so you can understand the pressure that an officer is under when they get a dispatch to a situation where they don't really know what's going on. They get there and it's a very tense situation. There's yelling and fighting going on, and sometimes, unfortunately, things can escalate beyond the way you'd like to see that it's done. But we're not hiring robots to be police officers. We hire human beings with emotions, human beings that have to make split-second decisions about life and death situations. Not only their own, but the people around them, and sometimes the life and death of the suspect. And then we get to sit back and review the videotapes, you know, like the NFL referees and instant replay, and go back through it and put it in slow motion and find it from 15 different angles and interview witnesses and see what happened. This officer has to make that decision in the instant that it happens. He doesn't get to go back and review things. So, yes, sometimes there's going to be mistakes, but by and large, officers do it right when they go out and respond to calls. There's always things we can do for training and psychological background checks and making sure that we have the right people in the field, but there's still people that we put out there to do this very, very dangerous job for us.
And I might add, not paid very much. But, you know, what happened to the thinking that when a police officer tells you to do something, you do it? You know, I don't particularly like getting stopped by the police. I haven't been stopped by the police in a long time because it's probably because I've gotten older and I've slowed down my car. But, you know, if a police officer tells you to be quiet, you be quiet. If a police officer tells you to sit down and be quiet, you sit down and be quiet. Where did we get started with this debating society with when a police officer stops you for a reason or one another? And I can appreciate if people think they're getting profiled, they're going to be upset and they're going to be agitated. However, nobody is thinking that if they just follow the instructions of the police officer, whether it's sit down and shut up or get your hands in the air or cross your legs and sit there, and I'll talk to you in a second. Where did we go off the rails with this idea that you can say anything you want to a police officer? To me, a police officer is like a judge. He's an officer of the court. And if a judge tells you to shut up, you're going to shut up or he's going to put you in jail. It's the same way as a police officer. So I know it's your personal opinion, but where did we go off the rails on this? I mean, it just seems like you mentioned Cornel West, whatever his name was back in Massachusetts, and I think you're onto something there. It kind of comes from the top down, but, people just react indignantly to law enforcement people talking to them. And I don't know where you saw this. You're right. I mean, it didn't just start with Obama, but somewhere along the line, society thought that they could get away with anything they wanted with the police.
Well, when you and I were growing up, we were taught to respect police officers and follow their instructions. And I was taught that if you disagree with the officer, the street is not the place to argue that out. Let the officer do his job, and then if there's a ticket or something else involved, you deal with that in the courts. And you deal with that somewhere else other than on the street where things can escalate and get out of hand. But unfortunately, we have large segments of society that are raised that the police are their enemy, that the police are going to kill you, the police are going to hurt you, the police are going to throw you in jail for no reason. And you build this mindset that it's automatically a combative enemy situation, and that's not healthy for the people on the street. That's not healthy for the police officers, and it's not good for society in general. At some point, we have to get back to a situation where we teach our people in school. Senator Whitmire proposed a bill for the legislature, and I don't necessarily agree with this bill, but basically a class on how to interact with a police officer when you're stopped for a traffic violation. But I don't know that you need a whole semester class on this, but there certainly needs to be some teaching of civics and civic responsibility and your role in society as a citizen in our school system, because in many cases, unfortunately, the children don't get it at home.
Right.
And we've got to help raise people so that they'll be safe, so that they don't needlessly go to jail, but also so that our officers are protected as well.
Talking to Bob Price from Breitbart, Texas. Bob, in the 2 minutes we've got left, want to do a speed round real quick, changing the subject completely. Ag Secretary, there's been a lot of talk about who the next Ag Secretary would be. Who are you hearing? What's Breitbart hearing?
Well, I have given up on guessing on who President-elect Trump is going to appoint to different situations, because he is thinking so far outside the box, and in almost every situation, I think he's done a phenomenal job in his picks. I don't think I've gotten a single one right yet, so I'm not going to predict on the Ag Commissioner position. But I think you will see a very qualified person come in, and somebody that will address it from a different angle than what has been done in the past. Agriculture is not just a commodity brokerage resource commercial thing. It's a national security issue. Our food supply is critical to our national security, and so we have to find a way to make sure that our farmers are protected, not only in terms of being able to make a profit in growing crops, but also in terms of trade deals that we have with other countries, so that we can grow these farms and have successful businesses that will be there to take care of us in any kind of crisis or emergency that develops in this country.
Bob, real quick, what can we expect from Breitbart and Breitbart Texas in 2017?
Well, I think our focus this year, of course, the border is always a critical focus for Breitbart Texas. Brandon, that's his pet project, and our heart and soul of our organization is reporting on what's going on at the border. But also, you're going to see with the legislative session there, we're going to be paying very close attention to what the legislature is doing and reporting on that. CPS is a big issue that you're going to see bipartisan activity on in the legislature, but we've got to find the right solution that's both cost-effective and meets the needs of taking care of this very critical situation with children that are in danger.
Talking to Bob Price at Breitbart, Texas. Bob, thank you so much, and have a happy New Year, and look forward to talking to you, and I look forward to running into you in Austin. Hope I can buy you a cup of coffee or lunch.
Yeah, we will see you there. And Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to you and your family, and to all of our listeners out there in Lubbock.
Thanks, Bob. Go online, read Breitbart, Texas, one of the best online news sources that you can find. You're listening to the Chad Hasty Show, 790 KFYO.